There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being around certain people. Not the tiredness from a long day or even a hard conversation. It's something quieter than that. It's the feeling after you've spent hours trying to figure out what someone else needs, what mood they're in, what version of them you're going to get today, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, you completely forgot to notice how you were feeling. You left the room knowing everything about their emotional state and almost nothing about your own. If you recognize that feeling, you probably didn't learn it recently. It's something that became automatic a long time ago, so early that it doesn't even feel like a skill. It just feels like how you are. And that's exactly where most people get it wrong about you. They see someone who is perceptive, accommodating, careful with others' feelings, and they assume you chose to be that way, that it's just your personality. What they don't see is the amount of invisible labor behind it, or the fact that tuning into everyone else's frequency was never really a choice, it was a requirement. And somewhere along the way, your nervous system simply accepted that requirement as the terms of being loved. What we're really talking about here is what happens to a child who grows up inside a relationship with a narcissistic parent. Not the word narcissist as people throw it around loosely, but the clinical reality of it. A parent whose need for admiration, control, and emotional centrality was so consuming that the child's inner world was never quite given room to exist. This doesn't get talked about with the accuracy it deserves. The effects aren't dramatic in the way people expect. They're not always visible, but they shape the architecture of a person in ways that take decades to understand. Psychologists who study what's called the parentified child, a child who unconsciously takes on the emotional management of a parent, have found something striking. These children don't just learn to be attuned to others. Their nervous systems literally develop around hypervigilance. The brain's threat detection system, centered in the amygdala, becomes finely calibrated to track emotional shifts in the people around them. What looks from the outside like empathy or social intelligence is, at its origin, a survival adaptation. The child learned that safety depended on reading the room correctly. Research in developmental psychology has long established that children need what's called a secure base, a caregiver whose emotional responses are consistent, predictable, and centered on the child's needs. When that caregiver is instead someone whose needs dominate the relationship, the child's development doesn't stop, it adapts. The child becomes the one who provides stability, who manages tension, who knows not to bring certain feelings into the room because those feelings would become a burden, or worse, a threat. Over time, that adaptation becomes invisible to the child themselves. It stops feeling like adjustment and starts feeling like identity. This is not a disorder. It is not dysfunction. It is a completely logical response to an environment that required it. The brain does not make mistakes about survival. What it does do is continue running old programs long after the original conditions have changed. And this is where it gets complicated. Because none of this makes someone broken or damaged in the way that word implies. It means something more precise than that. It means there are patterns of self-erasure, of difficulty identifying what you actually want, of feeling vaguely responsible for the emotional states of people around you that were adaptive once and may now be creating friction in relationships and in the relationship you have with yourself. The person who grew up having to earn love through attunement often struggles later in life to believe that love can exist without that transaction, that someone could simply want to be around you not because you're useful to them emotionally, but just because of who you are. Here's the part that rarely gets named. The hypervigilance that developed in childhood doesn't just create anxiety, it also creates extraordinary capacity. People who grew up this way have an almost uncanny ability to read emotional subtext, to de-escalate conflict, to hold space for others in pain. These are not small things. The world runs in many ways on the labor of people like this. The cost, though, is that the same sensitivity that makes someone so attuned to others can make their own inner experience feel strangely inaccessible. as though everyone else's feelings are in high definition and their own are slightly out of focus. That's not a character flaw. It's a map of where the attention was trained to go. There's also a particular grief that comes with this, one that arrives later in life, sometimes in therapy, sometimes just quietly in an ordinary moment. It's the grief of realizing that the parent you needed was not the parent you had, not because they were evil, not to assign blame, but simply as a fact, a gap between what a child requires and what was actually available. That grief is legitimate. It doesn't require a villain. It just requires acknowledgement. If you've spent years wondering why intimacy feels complicated, why you're more comfortable being needed than being wanted, why you sometimes feel most calm when you're the one holding everything together, this is the context. Not a diagnosis, not a label, just a thread that once you find it helps a lot of things make sense. The restlessness, the difficulty resting, the sense that your value to other people is always somehow conditional and always on the line. You are not too much. You are not too sensitive. You are someone whose earliest relationships asked you to be very, very careful, and your mind did exactly what minds do. It learned. It adapted. It protected you with everything it had. What's possible now, slowly, is something different. Not fixing what's broken, because that framing was never accurate. More like learning to include yourself in the room, to let your own feelings be as real and as valid as everyone else's. To discover, maybe for the first time in a conscious way, what you actually want when no one needs anything from you. That process is quiet, and it takes time, but it starts with understanding. And understanding starts exactly where you already are. If something in this felt familiar, there are other patterns that tend to live alongside this one, patterns that are just as rarely explained with the depth they deserve, that might be worth exploring next.